Welcome to Liner Notes. My name is David Bixler.
What if the patterns you see in the night sky weren't just constellations, but a musical score? Vibraphonist Patricia Brennan, an avid astronomer, has looked to the stars as the blueprint for her ambitious new record Of the Near and Far, out October 24th on Pyroclastic Records. 10-piece ensemble featuring pianist Sylvie Courvoisier, guitarist Miles Okazaki, along with a string quartet. In this episode of Liner Notes, we explore how one of the most innovative composers in creative music is turning celestial geometry into sound. Patricia Brennan, welcome to Liner Notes. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us this morning.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, and we are here. You have a new recording coming out of the Near and Far, which actually is going to be released October 24th on Pyroclastic Records. And this comes on the heels of your recording from last year, well received, Breaking Stretch. And so I want to jump into this music. You know, there's really a fascinating concept behind it. In reading about you, in addition to being a vibraphonist, percussionist, composer, and band leader, you are also an amateur or hobbyist astronomer. I don't know how far it goes beyond that. And so really this recording is most of the music is based on constellations of you transforming the constellations to music and some interesting diagrams in the liner notes that I want to talk about. So, boom, let's go there. I mean it's pretty huge and
Yeah,
very cool.
thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I mean, it's definitely, a different direction in some ways than Breaking Stretch, but I still use my same compositional approach, same processes and so on. So I don't completely consider it a left turn or anything like that. It's just a different focus, and I guess I'll start there. A lot of my records, or all my records, since my solo record, my first leader record, is reflecting some aspects of my musical life, my musical upbringing, my inspirations, and so on. So I was a classical percussionist before, but also I studied jazz and composition when I moved to New York to do my master's. So my musical background is quite vast. I grew up in a very rich musical environment in Veracruz, in Mexico. Lots of Afro-Cuban music, son cubano, son jarocho, all those different influences. My parents are, even though they're engineers, they're super fans of all kinds of music. So I'm trying to encapsulate all of those influences, all that I guess musical path, into all my records. So Breaking Stretch, for example, was focusing more on that spirit of salsa bands, rock bands with brass sections like Chicago, Earth, Wind and Fire, Tower of Power, things like that, which, was music that hugely influenced me when I was growing up. And then now, after Near and Far, I wanted to shift the focus into more of my, I guess, academic or conservatory upbringing as a classical percussionist. So, that's a tricky one because percussionists, in a sense, are very new instrumentalists. Percussion is such a new instrument. Even in that tradition, you find percussion, in Beethoven symphonies and things like that, but it's really just mostly timpani. It really wasn't that vast until more like, the 20th century and forward. So our repertoire as classical percussionists is really new. And so in a sense, I was influenced by those composers starting from the 1950s and so on, like Toru Takemitsu, so a great composer that wrote for marimba pieces or repertoire for percussion and other instruments. And even later on, like Steve Reich, Philip Glass, Yanis Xenakis, and even later on, a little bit closer to now, like members from Bang Can, like David Lang, so this whole record has a lot of that, I guess, spirit behind it. There's not direct influences from those composers, but it's just more visiting, how that music imprinted on me. So that influence, therefore, the instrumentation that I chose for this record, the direction that I was going to take musically and compositionally, etc. So yeah, that's in a sense a little general, background. So I'll stop here so in
Okay,
case you
yeah.
have more questions.
Well, I think the listener is gonna definitely pick up, like, on a new music vibe, on
Yes.
the thing. So, let me ask you, in reading, some of the information about you, you studied percussion at Curtis. Was that what brought you to the States from Veracruz?
Absolutely. So right before coming here, I actually had a job in an orchestra in Mexico. It's one of the top five orchestras in Mexico called Jalapa Symphony Orchestra. And I was 19 years old, and my job particularly was fifth percussionist, assistant timpanist. So as a fifth percussionist in an orchestra, you kind of don't have a lot to do. You're kind of sitting there for a long time counting measures, and once in a while, you play more modern repertoire, you play the mallets, xylophone parts, glockenspiel parts, bells, you play the small percussion parts. And if there's a two timpani part, you play the second timpani part and so on. So I was struggling a lot with feelings as to like, do I feel like a musician or not anymore doing that kind of job? And then aside, I was a soloist. I was playing in popular like son jarocho bands and Afro-Cuban bands and things like that. So I really enjoyed the aspect of just playing in a band, improvising, writing my own music. So in a sense, I was trying to find some kind of ticket or a way out of that situation. So coincidentally, the opportunity to go to Curtis fell into my lap, and I was like, okay, this is it. So even though Curtis is more of a classical conservatory, that was more like my ticket out of Mexico. So once I moved to Philly, pretty soon after, I was like, I want to be a soloist. I want to write my music. I want to improvise. I wasn't necessarily thinking specifically jazz at the time, just more improvisation in general. But because I was looking for that, I started studying with jazz musicians in Philly since my first year. So that's kind of immediately when I took that, that other term. But I still had to fulfill my requirements at Curtis because it's a free ride, and on top of that, you get financial assistance and everything. So to keep that, I had to make sure that I fulfilled everything that I needed to do there. So yeah.
Did you get any resistance from the higher ups, from your professor at Curtis in what you were pursuing when you, left campus?
Yeah, I know, not completely. I mean, I guess, from the overall school, actually, they were very encouraging because I think the spirit of Curtis, every student there is very creative, very smart, and even within the classical music world, like I remember like some good friends of mine, like pianists, like they were able to improvise in any kind of composer style, like improvise in Scriabin style and Beethoven style and so on. So they were extremely creative and inspiring. The theory teachers as well, their approach to teach theory wasn't so academic, it was more practical. So you have to improvise your own counterpoint exercises and things like that. So the approach already was pretty creative and open and focused on improvisation. Now, within the specific percussion department, I mean, I think my teacher really wanted me to be a timpanist, and to be a percussionist here in the States. And I did do a little bit of that. I played with Philly Orchestra when I was at Curtis. I did do some of those things. Like I said, I had to still fulfill what I needed to do there. But he was aware that I was taking, jazz vibraphone lessons, on the side, and that I wanted to do that. So I mean, now actually, he's obviously, super supportive, and I think recently even he commissioned me to write a piece for him, and so on. So now coming full circle is really beautiful. Obviously at the time it was a little tricky to manage, what I think the expectations he had for me, but I think he was also understanding of and respectful of where I wanted to do. So I think that was great.
Mhm. Do you have any, plans of, I don't know, bringing timpani into your group or some of the other percussion that you've studied?
Not so much into my groups, or at least for now, I haven't really thought about it. I think I have done it, in other groups. Actually, one of the first bands that I played with in this world was John Hollenbeck's Large Ensemble, and already my default setup is marimba and vibraphone and glockenspiel, so basically almost all the mallets. And there was one record which I think was songs that you like a lot, or we like, one of those records, where he actually had timpani as in one of the parts as well. So, and the recent one that I did with Hollenbeck, not with his band, but he did this. He had this project with the NDR big band, and I was part of that as well. I play timpani. I play all these other percussion instruments that I used to play. I think when I moved to New York, I consciously made a decision to, in a sense, just focus on mallet percussion, particularly vibraphone and marimba, partially because, the program that I did, the jazz program that I was studying at, is either vibes or drums, so I was like, I'm gonna go for vibes. And also I didn't want to have this double life, where I continue to play new music, but also I'm doing jazz gigs. I just wanted to fully focus on my, I guess, jazz, career and composition and everything. So because of that, I think I still, I'm in that mindset where I haven't really thought about incorporating those elements. But I think, I will. I have a percussion group project in mind that I'm gonna try some things out at my Stone Week in a few weeks. And I think for projects like that, I may expand back again to the other instruments that I used to play. So.
Okay. Now let's get into the music. You've chosen 5 constellations.
Mm-hmm.
And, it was really interesting to see in the booklet for the recording, you place drawings of the constellations over the circle of fifths, and where certain points line up, these become the basis of harmony, melody, and it looks like on some of them, this is above my pay grade, but maybe like the area of the constellation becomes
Mm-hmm.
meter or some kind of clave that you are, um, putting on everything. So, that's really fascinating, and, I'm interested how that came about, and if there was any disconnect. Did this make musical sense, or was this just maybe, it could easily just be an academic exercise. It does not come across as that at all. In fact, I listened to the recording several times before I, realized what was behind it. So,
Mm-hmm.
if you could explain a little bit about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as a composer, not just on this record, but since my solo record or before, I've always liked to explore other ways to get to the material than just a traditional way, which is, writing a chord progression or having a musical form or the traditional way that you learn in school. So I started to devise different techniques. Sometimes I use poetry, or I have, improv games that I use and so on, or I use mathematical formula sometimes, like the magic square or things like that, or Fibonacci series or things like that. So in this case, it was just another extension of the processes that I tend to use to not to write the music, but to get the raw material. And so ultimately all these processes, even though some of them may sound academic or may literally be academic, like mathematical formulas, is to me is just a starting point to just get a bunch of collection of pitches or of rhythmic structures, that I can then use later on for to write a piece. So in this case, I'm always fascinated by the sky. I'm a very, very amateur astronomer. And so I was always curious, because I see a lot of symmetry in the sky, and I was always curious if I will be able to translate that symmetry into music. So that's how sort of this came about. So the next step was, well, what's a symmetrical shape in music? So the circle of fifths is a very symmetrical shape, and in a sense a very universal shape where you get a lot of information out of it. So that seemed to me a good idea to pair those two things together. So yeah, so you mentioned already, some of this pitches that I get. Sometimes I use literally the pitches as a scale, but this is where I guess the translation begins, and it could really be so many things. Sometimes I use, for example, each pitch as a common note between different chords, or between a chord progression, or between a key signature. So if I had five pitches, I had a myriad of chords, to use out of this. So at the end of the day, in the piece, I may not use all of that information, or it might be a starting point, but then the piece kind of leads me to somewhere else. I told my students, my composition students, I have two kind of, not rules, but guiding principles whenever I use this kind of academic quote unquote processes, which is, at the end of the day, whenever I'm trying things out, does it feel good to you? And does it sound good to you? Regardless of what the numbers and what the data dictates. And that's where, potentially you steer away from it, or you try different things out until you find something that feels good to you and that sounds good to you. For example, the numbers, you mentioned the area of the constellations. I do use the numbers, and this is a consistent theme throughout all my music. I also used it for my septet record as well, using numbers to write claves or rhythmic structures, or sometimes even just using one number to generally come up with different breakdowns of a time signature, that wouldn't necessarily be the usual way. So, for example, the number five, as musicians, by default, we break it down into two and three, or three and two, and that's pretty much it. But, sometimes I try to do, micro elements of 10 within the big five, and it's divided between four, three, and three, which, if I were to come from the musical place, I'm probably would have never thought of doing that, which is why sometimes coming from this, I guess, foreign place or academic place, it presents all these different possibilities with those kind of numbers. So in this case, yes, sometimes it will dictate a time signature of the piece. Sometimes it will dictate elements. For example, Antlia, the first track of the record, has a lot of different polyrhythms within the different layers. So all those polyrhythms were variants of some of those numbers that were dictated by the system. So literally each piece has even though it starts from the same diagram, it has a different translation process that serves the piece in place. So yeah.
All right. One thing that I thought about when I was looking at these diagrams, you had some leeway. You could have turned the constellation in a different way. You could have made it bigger or smaller, as well as the circle of fifths, and had it intersect at different points. Did you play with that at all? Or what determined how they were overlapped?
Yeah, so the first thing that I use is the position that I was looking at the constellations as. Whatever I was in that time, which was summer of 2024, so northern hemisphere. So that dictated, for example, the angle, how I was going to place a constellation on circle of fifths, because it could have been completely backwards, and so on. So that was the first thing that I used. Then, I mean, the next thing I was trying to, I guess, fit the area of the constellation inside of the circle. I didn't necessarily experiment with the, I guess, the magnification or diminution of the constellation over the circle. I wanted to mainly be within the circle, and that was the main goal. And I think I did that because that way most of the points will directly hit, inside the circle. But there's some that, like Aquarius, for example, that kind of gets out of the circle regardless, even though I was trying to fit it in still. It's just too big. That doesn't really fit that area. So, the translation process of this, it's not exact. There was an element where it was just kind of rounding it about, where I thought it could potentially, be. And sometimes, two stars wouldn't necessarily hit on a dot. They were kind of in between two keys. So then in that case, I would just make the decision, okay, I'm going to incorporate both of those letters because it happens to be right in the middle, or the transition letters between one point to the other, all of the letters in between, I will incorporate those. So I would have to kind of make those decisions kind of almost like one constellation at a time. But mainly the direction, I guess that was the most, I guess, scientific one, which is just whatever I was seeing that from my perspective.
Alright. Let's move on to the musicians that you chose, to
Hmm.
realize your project. I thought it was interesting in the PR for the project, it states that you have a 10-piece ensemble, and the one of the members of the ensemble is the conductor. And maybe, talk about the need for the conductor in your work on this recording.
Yeah, I mean, I think as I was writing it, at first I didn't think that I was going to use a conductor. But, as I was writing this piece, for example, pieces like When You Stare Into the Abyss, that piece is actually fully like through compose. There's really the only improvisation that happens is the vibraphone intro with the electronics at the beginning. That's improvised. But then as soon as the piece commences, it's through compose. Actually, there's two layers that are improvisatory, which is the percussion, John Hollenbeck's layer, and Sylvie's layer, the piano layer. So what I did for them, I gave them gestures and pitches that they should be using at certain moments of the piece, but it was up to them how they interpret those gestures. So I guess that was the only two elements that were improvisatory of this, but it's not in the traditional sense where they solo over changes or things like that. It was just more textural. But everything else, the string, the guitar, the bass, the vibes, all that is fully written. The only thing that the strings have that is at their discretion is they do some glissandos from one note to the other. There's some written in, but then there's some where it's basically it's ad libitum. So whatever they feel they want to make a glissando to the next note that's written, that is up to them. So there's elements like that that are aleatory, but in that case it's a very slow moving piece that if we didn't have a conductor, it would be extremely challenging because there's no beat, there's no, even though there is in a grid of 4/4, there's no drum beat or anything like that to rely on, sonically. So a conductor was in a sense crucial for a piece like that to make sure that we're all moving through the same uh at the same pace in the kind of this molasses type of way, because that piece kind of moves that way. So that's when, pieces like that, when I was like, okay, I'm really gonna need a conductor for this to help us, I guess get through the music, in a musical way without having to worry about, where I am in this moment, in time, so that way the instrumentalist can focus more on the improvisatory aspects or aleatory aspects of the music, and not have to worry about, also where they are in a complex piece like that, for example, where there's no drum beat or things like that. So that's an example as to why the conductor was crucial for this project.
And was he present on more than that piece, like on many of the pieces or the entire session, except for obviously the electroacoustic piece?
Yeah. Yeah, he was present for all of it, except for Sid Lally, the electroacoustic track. I mean, partially, for example, Antlia, even though Antlia, the first track of the record, has a drum beat, a very clear groove, there's a lot of polyrhythms happening there. So even though, again, it would be in 4/4, but the viola layer has a 7/4, the guitar has 5/4. So there's all this rhythmic complexity happen in a large group. So I think if it was like a quintet or a sextet, maybe we wouldn't have needed a conductor for that. But just because of the nature of the music, particularly where individual layers that lead into I guess a big texture. So it's when you listen to a texture, sometimes it's hard to pinpoint which layer is what, which is what I wanted to. Like Aquarius is the same case where each string player has a very specific layer that when you listen to it as a whole, you have no idea which one is doing what, right? And a lot of this music, I purposely was trying to do that constantly. Where who's playing what at what times, and including the electronics. Sometimes there's some electronics that I am doing with my setup. Some electronics are coming from the electronic musician, or from Miles from his effects, and then also there's some acoustic elements that sound electronic that you don't know. So I wanted to keep that nebulosity in the music. So because of that, if we didn't have a conductor when trying to figure out a way for that musical cue, it would be really confusing sometimes. So that's where the conductor was super helpful in all of the tracks, regardless whether there's a drum beat or not.
Alright. Were any of the electronics added after the fact?
Yes, so the Arturo, the electronic musician, all his contributions were added after the fact. Now, the cool thing is, actually, before we did this recording, we had done a series of performances at the Jazz Gallery here in New York. So with the electronic musician live, doing this processing live at the show, so the musicians, when we were in the studio, they already knew where the electronics were going to be, right? Okay, they were aware, okay, right now in this section I'm improvising, but I'm aware that the electronic musician is going to be doing things here. So it was really cool to see how all of them were improvising with that awareness in mind in the studio, because you will improvise differently if you know this is it, this is all we have, right? So we all had that awareness, but thankfully, because we had performed this material live, we sort of knew what the expectations were of the post-production electronics. So I mean, that's always challenging when you're recording something with a missing layer and you don't know what's happening. But yeah, that was super helpful. So yeah.
So on December 1st, you have an album release concert at Roulette, and will it be the same musicians performing?
Yes. Yeah, the CD release show is going to be the band. I mean, I was lucky
That's
that
amazing.
everybody was. Yeah, I was just like, oh my god! As soon as I sent the email, everybody was like, yes, yes, yes. I was like, oh my goodness, this is great. So
That's phenomenal. I'm gonna try to
yeah.
get out for that for sure. I would love to hear this live. I guess before I let you go, the final track, "When You Stare into the Abyss." Maybe talk about that, and, I to me, there's a lot of elements to your music, and, you described some of it before, and as a listener, to me, it's a lot of things that are kind of pulling, on and against each other, which is super cool, but, to me, it ends with a triad, and,
Hmm.
it's beautiful, so, maybe tell us here just your
Yeah.
concept about, like, what you see when you're looking into this abyss.
Yeah, I mean, it's that piece is an homage to what I feel every time I look through my telescope, or just without a telescope. And like I was saying, I think in the liner notes, it's easy to not feel overwhelmed sometimes of the magnitude of the universe, and how sometimes insignificant, not only we are, but all of our problems and everything that happens here on Earth. But also in a philosophical level too, sometimes, you know, things, when we stare at something for too long, it could completely change our perspective and change our whole emotional wiring. So it's almost like a warning, as well, to kind of keep the hope and keep the shining light ahead of us, regardless of what's we're encountering in that moment, what monster or abyss we're encountering in that moment. So this piece was really special emotionally, to express that feeling. So I mean, actually, compositionally, this piece, one of my favorite composers is Ligeti, and his orchestral works. And because of the technique that he uses, micropolyphony, it always felt to me that it just feels like this, like like morph of sound just slowly moving, and or massive sound slowly moving and transforming. and then you see light coming through it, but then you see darkness coming through. It's almost like gas, like sonic gas or something like that. So I wanted to really represent that with this piece, which was, was challenging because, depending of how you place things in the score, you could break that effect or continue to develop it. Also to have a big arc flow to this piece was also challenging compositionally. So it was super fun to write. And then you mentioned like it ends on a B flat major triad, and that's something, again, a reminder that even though this whole record comes from a very quote unquote academic place or theoretical place, at the end of the day, I'm still writing music and I'm still connecting to those beautiful and simple elements of music, which is a major triad. And I think sometimes we get too lost in complexity. And that's something that, again, I always try to keep in mind. Even though the source is complex, at the end of the day, it's just a source, and I'm only going to use what the music is asking me to use, whether, if it's actually a complex element and there's a purpose for it or not. Sometimes it could be completely simple. So it really is, ultimately the music is dictating what I need to use from those processes. And simplicity, there's a beauty to it. And it doesn't have to be, if that's what the music is calling for, and if it's purposeful, then let's go for it, so yeah.
All right. Patricia, I thank you for your time. The record is Of the Near and Far, out October 24th. Album release concerts, if you happen to be in Berlin at the Jazz Festival on November 1st, and in New York City at Roulette on December 1, go check it out. Congratulations on the recording. All the best to you. Take care.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Liner Notes is grateful for the support of Van Doren Reeds and Mouthpieces. Be sure and check out the Van Doren Advisory Studio in New York City for all your sound sculpting needs. Liner Notes is grateful for the support of Arlen's Good Beer in Bowling Green, Ohio.
Engineered by Marco Mendoza. Visit his website at engineeredbymarco.com. The theme music is Hide Seek Find from my record Beatitude, out on Tiger Turn.
Produced by David Bixler. Be sure and subscribe to Liner Notes wherever you find your podcasts. If you like what you hear, I ask that you consider supporting Liner Notes financially. You can do this by going to the Liner Notes tab at davidbixler.com. Thank you for your consideration.